Brought to you by Penguin. Life Class by Pat Barker. Read by Finlay Robertson, Eve Webster, Kieran Bew and Juliet Prague.
Part 1. Chapter 1. They'd been drawing for over half an hour. There was no sound except for the slurring of pencils on Michelet paper or the barely perceptible squeak of charcoal. At the centre of the circle of students, close to the dais, a stove cast a barred red light onto the floor. The smell of burning coke mingled with other smells: sweat, hot cloth, cigar and tobacco smoke. Now and again you could hear the soft pop of lips inhaling, and another plume of blue smoke would rise to join the pall that hung over the whole room. Nobody spoke. You were not allowed to talk in the life class. In the antiques room, where they spent the mornings copying from casts of classical and Renaissance sculpture, talking was permitted, and the students, a few of the women in particular, chattered non-stop. Here, apart from the naked woman on the dais, the atmosphere was not unlike a men's club. The women students had their own separate life class somewhere on the lower floor. Even the Slade, scandalously modern in most respects, segregated the sexes when the naked human body was on display. Paul Tarrant, sitting on the back row, as far away from the stove as he could get, coughed discreetly into his handkerchief. He was still struggling to throw off the bronchitis that had plagued him all winter, and the fumes irritated his lungs. He'd finished his drawing, or at least he'd reached the point where he knew that further work would only make matters worse. He leaned back and contemplated the page, not one of his better efforts. He knew, without turning to look, that Professor Tonks had entered the room. It was always like this with Tonks, a quiet entry. He seemed to insinuate himself into the room. You knew he'd arrived only when you saw the students sitting opposite straighten their shoulders or bend more anxiously over their drawings. Tonks was a dark planet whose presence could be deduced only by a deviation in the orbit of other bodies. Paul risked a sidelong glance. Tonks, bent at the shoulders like a butcher's hook, was scrutinizing a student's drawing. He said something, too low to be heard. The student mumbled a reply and Tonks moved on. Another student, then another. He was working his way along the back row, passing quickly from drawing to drawing. Sugden brought him to a halt. Sugden was hopeless, among the worst in the class. Tonks always spent more time on the weaker students, which indicated a kindly disposition, perhaps, or would have done, had he not left so many of them in tatters. So far his progress had been quiet, but now suddenly he raised his voice. "For God's sake, man, look at that arm! It's got no more bones in it than a sausage. Your pencil's blunt, your easel's wobbly, you're working in your own light, and you seem to have no grasp of human anatomy at all. What is the point?" Many of Tonks's strictures related to the student's ignorance of anatomy. "Is it a blancmange?" had been one of his comments on Paul's early efforts. Tonks had trained as a surgeon and taught anatomy to medical students before Professor Brown invited him to join the staff at the Slade. His eye, honed in the dissecting room and the theatre, detected every failure to convey what lay beneath the skin. "Look for the line," he would say again and again. "Drawing is an explication of the form." It was one of the catchphrases Slade students sometimes chanted to each other, along with, "I, thy God, am a jealous God. Thou shalt have none other Tonks but me." There was no getting round Tonks's opinion of your work. Tonks was the Slade. Paul looked at his drawing. If he'd been dissatisfied before, he was dismayed now. As Tonks drew closer, his drawing became mysteriously weaker. Not only had he failed to explicate the form, but he'd also tried to cover up the failure with all the techniques he'd learned before coming to the Slade. Shading, cross-hatching, variations in tone, even, now and then, a little discreet smudging of the line. In the process, he'd produced a kind of drawing that at school, and even later in night classes, had evoked oohs and ahs of admiration. Once, not so long.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?